Thank you, Michael, for your kind introduction. Welcome all to my talk. Today I won't be talking art history. This picture will be the only painting you will see today. Unfortunately, I should say. I love to talk about paintings. I could talk also an hour about this painting alone. But enjoy it while it lasts. And then you will see a lot of other boring slides with text and that kind of stuff. The talk is also more about Daoism, not art history, but I will also talk a lot about East-West exchanges. In keeping with our project's theme, the talk will focus on this question of actually how the West looks at Daoism and how the Chinese themselves look at Daoism. And for that project, I selected this text, the Chinese. It's called the Fangdao Yulu. It's called like the record of inquiries about the Dao. It just basically interviews with Daoists, just a text. And the fun thing is that this text was published in 1968 based on a lot of like notes taken by a person interviewing these people. And at the same time, this is a period, the Republican period. It happened in Taiwan, but all these Daoists came from mainland China at a time. So they represent like this long Republican period after the fall of the dynasty in 1911, the last dynasty, the Qing dynasty. I will talk a bit more about the detail later, but then you know about what it's about. And at the same time, there happened to be the founder, basically, of Daoist studies in the West. He's called Kristofer Schipper. He was also my professor in Leiden. And he happened to be there to study as the first Westerner Daoism. And then he went back to Paris and established basically Daoist studies in the West. And so that happened at the same time in Taiwan. This book appeared. And he was there, and he's even mentioned, we will come across that in this book, in the preface. So there's a nice contact point between these two. And just as it happens to be, the views on Daoism, or what is important in Daoism, they're just two case studies. You can't say they represent everything, but they're just two case studies who have completely opposite views of what Daoism should be. So that's also the question. I don't think anybody noticed it, but I think we should address this question. So this talk will be about that. And because we study esoteric practices, and these interviews all deal with esoteric practices, it will begin with, just like discussing these esoteric practice, and then we move on to the so we move on to the more comparison stuff. So these are the topics I will discuss. So introduced is the Fangdao Yulu, the survey of esoteric practices, condition and procedures, like a general overview of what in general these practice amount to. What are you doing? Like there's a process, like few steps. The historical background of this Fangdao Yulu and why it was produced, and what kind of historical climate it fits, and then how it views Daoism. And then I will talk about Kristofer Schipper and how he established Daoism in the West, and then some concluding remarks. This talk comes with a few disclaimers. This is work in progress. I just started, so I don't know all the precise details of these Daoist practices. I still have to translate it. And that's the project. I will translate it, study it, and write this kind of introduction. So that's one disclaimer. Another one is, I know you are all mostly anthropologists, religious studies, and there are only a few sinologists, and usually I talk to sinologists, so you won't know the language and all these names. So I will try to keep it simple as possible, but still it's a sinological research. So If you don't understand, please ask me. Of course, these are esoteric practices in China. To me, they're very common, but I would really like to know what you think of them. So afterwards, if you have any questions, also people online who follow it on Zoom, you can type in your question in the chat box, or you first note them down, and later we can have a discussion when we we can have you can answer all your questions. And because this is also work in progress, and there is some anthropological research in there. Also would like to have your opinion and criticism. I would be very happy to hear what you think of it. So let's get started. Well, this is the book. It's like 250 pages. It's quite a lot. The author is Li Leqiu. Oh, sorry, that should be 1904, not until 1995. He's only 1 year old. Yeah, I just see it now, luckily. He's from mainland China and came to Taiwan after the fall of the Republic. He fled with the KMT. It records like 50. He interviews 53 people, and they're not like traditional interviews. It wasn't intended as this compilation of people. They were just his random notes. He would go around looking for masters. He was practicing himself, and he's like, what's the best way to learn? I'm going to ask all these people I know. So there are 53 and some are more coherent, like discussions, and some are just random notes. There are a lot on like details on terminology. What does this mean? And what does that mean? Like more encyclopedic questions. So it's very random. So as I told, many of these people were from mainland China. They came to Taiwan after 49, and most of them are also like what we would call Daoist or trained by Daoists. I don't know what. Yeah, this is this kind of definition, but you can also find a Catholic priest in there talking about his methods, a pastor, a gardener, a gym teacher, professors, some are very famous, like Na Huaijing is mentioned in there. He's like one of the most famous scholars on this kind of stuff, mostly known for Buddhism, but he was, I think, equally known for Buddhism and Daoism. Soldiers, all kinds of people are, some have no information. So what are the discussions about? Well, very general, I would call them like a hodgepodge of longevity techniques, self-cultivation, inner alchemy. And the Chinese terms used, well, these are called Yangsheng, and which is basically nurturing life or your health, or it's a very ancient term, and usually it means now longevity techniques, but it's already mentioned in the Zhuangzi and pointing to these, also including these very esoteric practices like sitting in a kind of meditation. Xianxue literally means like immortal studies. If you want to translate Xian as an immortal, I don't know if that's the right translation. And Dan Dao, that's the last one. That's elixir Dao. It is about creating elixir inside your body. It's like immortality as well, at least a kind of spiritual body you create inside yourself, for which you have to do all kinds of exercises. So it's a very broad, usually identified with self-cultivation. You would maybe call it inner alchemy, but I'm not sure if that covers everything which is discussed in here. So if each chapter, the person is introduced only 1 or 2 lines, sometimes 4 or 5, something none, by the author, where he's from, and so you can get some information who his master was, if it's known. Sometimes it's not known, and there are some details on his techniques, and then a discussion follows. So the emphasis is all on these techniques, methods. Like I said, terminologies, where is this located? Because in these techniques, self-cultivation techniques, your body has a lot of special places. They have names. So where is this located? Where is that located in the head or on your body? Like this elixir field, you have 3. In yoga, you have 7 chakras, but in Daoism, you only have 3. You could call it a chakra or whatever, maybe similar, like an energy point in your body, like in your belly, in your chest, and in your head. But of course, these are very common things, but they're far more abstruse points in your, related to your body. Some are not. Like the most famous one is like the Xuanguan, or the mystery pass, the gate of mystery, is not in your body and not outside your body. So it's mentioned a lot in this text. So what should we do with this point? And each of these masters, they give some kind of opinion. This book was very popular. So he was encouraged by friends, you should compile it into a book. He already published like short versions in a journal, and you compile them into a book and publish it. And when it was published, it was almost immediately reprinted. It was immediately sold out. So there was a good market for it, and it was very popular. And I think because at the time, the book, at least as far as I know, there are only mainland Chinese practitioners interviewed. Maybe some are not, but mainly from mainland China. So it means that originally in Taiwan, this kind of techniques or this kind of Daoism wasn't very common. But that's still something I have to explore further. I can't tell for sure, but because these people were from mainland China, that would imply that these people were not from Taiwan, at least not local or locally trained with local masters. So that says something on the at least it was very popular. Also, the scope to find like 53 interviews of people talking about secret techniques, esoteric practices, is very uncommon. I would say unique. I don't know any other book comparable to this, and not in a modern time. You have on the internet, you often have people interviewing Daoist masters, but it's never as profound or wide as this text. It's also fairly unknown. I say fairly. I thought it was completely unknown, but Fabrizio told me there was like a few parts where it were translated by Thomas Cleary. So apparently it was already a bit known, but he mentioned the text Fangdao Yulu, but no characters. I don't think anybody would be able to trace it to this book. And as far as I know, it's only mentioned like 2 or 3 times in an article somewhere, but nothing special has been done with it. So, and I think it represents this Republican period from 1911 to the 70s, or whatever you want to call it, in Taiwan, this entire period of early modern, early 20th century Daoist practices in China. So it's quite a valuable source for research, and I think if I translate it, it would be a nice addition to many people, for scholars, but also for many practitioners. In the West, it's more common to study, to go to China, or even Chinese Daoists, they go to America and Europe, and it's comparable to yoga, I think, what you would do, but there are no Western translation, or at least good translations of these kind of books. And this would be a nice book. Survey of esoteric practices. I I would like to make a table of all these 53 figures, and then where they're from, and lineages, and their esoteric practices, maybe texts they mentioned, but well, that's premature at the time. So I just made a quick little overview of all these techniques they mention, at least in the text. This is just random. Maybe I missed a few, I don't know, but these are the most common terms you see, and you can also almost immediately see how broad it is. It's not just one technique everybody practices. There are many different names. We'll talk about that later. So first, exercises, very important, but Tai Chi Chuan is considered one of them. It's called the I Ching Jing. And the Baduan Jing, that's more common. There's well known, the 8 pieces of brocade. They're just like stretching, these kind of breathing exercises. Tai Chi Chuan, I think everybody knows. It's like shadow boxing. So it's mentioned. It's quiet sitting. Jingzuo, that's a general term for meditating or meditation in Chinese. I should say meditation as a term is unknown in China. They have a huge variety of other terms, like Zen or Chan. Dhyana is the traditional Buddhist term for meditation, but the Chinese themselves had no term for meditation. And I think we would think, when we think of meditation, we think, oh, you would sit there, maybe close your eyes, and maybe in a more Buddhist or sense or yoga sense. But the Chinese, they have this kind of practice. You mentioned this text as sitting with you loosened your jacket and with your legs spread out. That's a form of meditation. in the Zhuangzi, it's mentioned, because you should be relaxed. But also sleeping and in fact, what Daoist priests or masters will tell you nowadays as well, meditation or this practice, you do it always. It's not that you have to sit down or you have to lay down and do this or that. In fact, the goal is like always. There's no difference between practice and not. So meditation means something different in the West than in China. There's no original term for meditation, but in case you know. So sleep method as well, that would be lying meditation, and it's a specific type. I like this one because it's a very ancient one, but I couldn't find it again. I read it before, and apparently there was one guy, one of these masters, he could like sleep for 2 weeks. And of course, that reminds me of another famous Daoist master, he could sleep for 100 days. And there's an even earlier one, I forgot his name, but like in the late 2nd century, the Han Dynasty, he could also sleep for a couple of months. Well, these are the most famous persons always in history. So that still exists. There's Shui Gong, and the other one is Jingzuo or Zuo Gong, sitting exercise. Gong is exercise or work, or like in Kung Fu, the boxing. Other thing mentioned is stretching and pulling, Daoyin. Maybe that's the more traditional type of Tai Chi Chuan, I Ching Jing stuff. There are dietary techniques, not just simple like trying to slim down, but eating very special stuff and leaving out all the rest, or very to like medicine. This type of for replenishing certain kind of organs or energies, that kind of stuff. Breathing exercises, they are also very old. What's it, tuna, spitting out and taking in your breath. Fuqi is swallowing breath, to swallow it. Another one, lianqi, is practicing your breath, but probably referring to circulating it. And the other one is tai chi. That's a type of breath that you basically close off all your breaths and that you start breathing like an embryo. Tai Chi is like embryonal breathing. Another exercise or practice mentioned abstaining from cereals, bigu. I don't think that actually what you do is not eat cereals. Sometimes it just means eating nothing. Don't eat anything. I don't think it's a goal, but just a means to a goal. So, for example, when you have to go into the mountains to practice this kind of meditation for a long time, there isn't much food, so you should be able to go without food for a long time. So that can be trained. Another one mentioned is also an ancient one in China, the art of the bedchamber, Fangdao Yulu. And later, there's another term, yin yang shuangxiu, yin yang pai. That's how should we call it? Sexual arts. I don't know if we should call it sexual magic, because it's meant for self-cultivation. And the yin yang shuangxiu, they claim it's not just for self, but for both. Precise details. I think this is one of the most popular topics in Daoist studies. There's so many articles on this this stuff. I found out it's incredible. Very ancient times, and the art of the bedchamber is often interpreted as almost like stealing the energy of a woman and replenish your own energy as a man, and that you have to sleep like with 100 women. Always meaning that you cannot ejaculate, but by stealing this, you can become an immortal. But whatever. The yin yang double cultivation say it's not like that. You don't steal, but I don't see actually the difference. If you know about Kundalini, if you have heard of it, apparently they have the same kind of exercise. The meaning is that you have to not ejaculate and using your essences and transmit it to the brain, to the top crown of your head, that kind of stuff, which in Kundalini also exists. But the difference is that in Kundalini, as far as I've been able to trace, it's only mentioned first time in like 8th or 9th century text. And this is much older. This is like already in the Mawang Dui scriptures of the 2nd century BC, this kind of techniques are already mentioned. So it's very ancient. And maybe that's why so people are interested in it. Then the last one, which is mostly discussed in the Fangdao Yulu, is this inner alchemy or elixir Dao or nature destiny double cultivation. It's called Xingming Shuanqiu. It's like body and spirit, but it's like solo cultivation, even though it says you don't need a woman to do that. And usually the goal is the same. You have to transmit your essences to the crown of your head and then circulate it, and you have a smaller circle and a greater circle. And if you can maintain that kind of process, you can become immortal. That's what they say. So all these masters discuss various aspects of these topics, sometimes combination, sometimes only one, very complicated. It's not like a structured whole. And as a whole, these are already mentioned, as I hinted at, many ancient texts in China, going back for at least 2,000 years. It's nothing new. Also interesting to focus on, because texts are always the prime subject of any scholar in the West. If you want to study religion, you have to know the text. But texts are only very few. These masters don't say you have to read this text and then you know that and that. This is the essence of what we do, and you have like a manual or something. Hardly. They mention text, but they're usually all the same. There's just a few handful. And you should know that in Daoism, since there's Daoist studies since the 70s, we studied the Daoist canon, which is a huge collection of texts of 1,400 different books. And some books are maybe just one chapter, but some books have a scroll, but some have like 200 or 300 scrolls, which is huge. There's so many Daoist texts, it's incredible. But for these masters, there are only a few. The first one's probably the best known, the Tao Te Ching, the Book of the Way and the Way into Power. The second one is maybe a little less known, but Huang Dingjing, it's mentioned quite a lot in this text, which is interesting because it's a text from the 2nd century, around the 2nd century, and a later version of 4th century, but dealing with the same stuff. So there's also this continuation. Wu Zhenpian is more about this inner alchemy of the 10th century. Then there's some older text, usually as the scripture of the hidden talisman, Yi Fu Ting, the Cang Ji, and the I Ching. These are always discussed together. And then elixir scriptures is just a common name for books related to this inner alchemy. There's a book which is also often mentioned quite a lot in this text, curiously. So it must have been had a great impact on these Daoist masters. A book from another Daoist master from the 19th century, mid-19th century, and also his commentaries on these other texts like the Tao Te Ching and the I Ching are very famous. And there's also one master mentioning that you have to read these Buddhist sutras. So they are also mentioned. So if you want to know anything, like a basis or introduction to Daoism or these kind of practices, they recommend reading these texts. But only very few actually discuss these techniques. They're just very obscure philosophical works. This is like my own compilation of what generally the process is of reaching this final stage, if you want to call it immortality or reaching the Tao. And there's some conditions you should follow, or so like steps you should follow. So it doesn't mean that all aspects should be dealt with. And many of these masters only mention a few of these steps, but I just compiled them into one. So you can read text or you cannot read text, it doesn't matter. But some are more essential, like seek a master, Bai Shi. You can only be introduced, you cannot learn it from a little book and find enlightenment, if you want to put it that way. You need to have his oral instructions. So the Daoist text, the exercises, dietary techniques, these are more like preparatory techniques, if you wouldn't call it that way. And then if you think, I want to learn more, then you seek a master, and he will tell you if you're suitable. He will tell you what these texts mean and how you should practice. And then after you got these oral instructions, these people say, then you also understand better these texts, what they actually mean. Because they, as I said, they're very obscure and mysterious language. Probably you will have to find a place to cultivate yourself. So that can be like a secluded spot, maybe in your home, like a little room, but often it's for a prolonged time. So you need to find a place with pure air. So in the mountains, maybe, or maybe in a cloister, in a monastery or in a temple somewhere, but very far away, where people cannot disturb you. So then you have to practice for a long time. So sometimes it's months, years, also on the specific times of the year. So they give all these kind of instructions. It's also mentioned that after you reach this stage, so you transform your body, you don't no longer need to do these exercises or follow this special diet. It's no longer important. One other important aspect, not all of them mentioned, but it's also very ancient. This idea of this concept of inde, it's like hidden virtue. you should perform good deeds. You cannot become an immortal or reach the end if you haven't done good deeds. There is a moral aspect to it. Often it's forgotten. It's not simple technique. And not all of these masters mention it, but many do, that you have to accumulate good deeds. And the most important thing is that you cannot ask anything for a return. So it should not be open. It's like secret. You should help people, but it's not that you should try to get anything from it in return. So then it's hidden virtue. Yes?
What means magic here?
Miracles? Yeah, that's what I put. So you can healing and magic. Yeah, it's mostly related. It's a difficult term, but I don't know how to explain it. But so if you can heal with medicine or maybe with acupuncture, you can help people, but there are also other ways of helping people, which then I would call magic, or maybe with talismans or spells or just a common name. I just use magic for the convenience sake. But it's not for yourself, it's to help other people. That's the difference. For example, there's also it's not mentioned in here, but it's called exterior or alchemy. And you have inner alchemy and outer alchemy. So actually making gold or cinnabar with making gold from cinnabar. But it's always mentioned that you cannot keep that gold for yourself. You cannot just produce gold and then buy a car or something. And in fact, it's always mentioned that you should, like the Baobuzi says, you should put it in a little bag and leave it on a busy marketplace. It's not for yourself. And the other half of the portion of this gold you should digest, and then you should be able to become aware. But this is ancient stuff. This is not in this text. Well, when you complete it or almost complete it, you will see that you have a lot of benefits. That's part of the self-cultivation. You transform both spiritually and physically. You become much more healthy. You become younger. I don't know if all your wrinkles will disappear. Probably not. But some say your teeth can even grow back and your hair will become black again if you have gray hair. I haven't seen it, but that's also a very ancient, like 2,000-year-old, these kind of sayings. I don't know if it's just a trope or some kind of myth, but I've heard stories of these Daoist masters in a monastery and then practicing and coming out of his seclusion and then with his hair all black, and then everybody was clapping. So like everybody could see that he managed to complete this transformation. I don't know, maybe he dyed it, or you never know. But it's you can't check these kind of stories. You have much more strength, and you can walk for hours, climbing mountains, even when you're old. And I think, the Daoist masters I've seen, even though they're very old, they're full of vigor. I don't know. I was once with Ren Farong, and walking behind him, he's like the patriarch or the head of the Daoist Association. And he was like this very big guy, and I was like 70 or 80, and he was full of strength. This was amazing. Maybe it was just healthy, but we don't know. No sleep or food needed. That's basically because you can always meditate or whatever, you don't sleep anymore. It's like this. It's not like not sleeping, it's also not awake. It's something like in between. And you're able to absorb, they call it the 先天一气, the one energy from prior heaven, or complicated, this original energy that's in the cosmos, and that you can absorb it. So basically, you don't need food and you don't need sleep. You tap into this source, this cosmic power, or whatever, and then But of course, you can just sleep and you can eat, but it's not like a necessity. And finally, one was mentioned in this text as Huanggu, doesn't actually mean that you change your bones, but that you, also the organs, I think, just means that you, like growing new teeth, you decay. When you grow old, everything becomes brittle and your bones, everything, but you completely replenish your bodily health. So become basically young. That also means for the organs. So, and then the final goal would be then to achieve the Dao, as it's called, the Dao or Chen Dao or whatever. And the common terms used then is Huanshu, returning to the void or emptiness, which is then another name for the Dao, or unification of heaven and man. That's also an ancient one. You can similar phrase you can find in the. So you basically become one with the cosmos. You're completely in harmony with nature, but not just nature here around, but in the cosmic sense. And now it's also a very common term in communist ideology lately of Xi Jinping, I found out, because it mentioned somewhere, and all this, and then he suddenly said, so I think, well, what does he mean with that? Does he know what it means? But okay. So this is, as I said, just a general outline. I think this is also important to discuss. What's special about these topics, because you probably, for most of you, this is all completely new, but for people studying these esoteric practice or Daoist techniques, there's some very peculiarities about this Fangdao Yulu, and because it points to some very different aspects of Daoism that's usually not known or discussed, or as we understand Daoism now, this is different. But I first tell you what's different, and then later we can discuss why it's different. So, as I mentioned, all these methods and lineages are different. They all preach, they say they have a certain technique or a method, or and they use same terminology, but they're different. They're taught different, but they all have the same goal. The goal is all the same for them. If they actually reach that goal, or if there's a difference in achievement or accomplishment, I cannot say. But yes.
So the goal is the
one
at the bottom.
Yes, that one. Yeah, that's what I then call the goal. Yeah.
So it's going beyond longevity, but unification with Dao.
Yeah, I think many have different terms to name this goal. I think longevity, long life, long health, that's what they all aspire to, at least being healthy and grow old. And I think all die. And for some we don't know where they ended up, but probably they still died. Some claim they can become more than 100 years, or maybe even like 200 years, but we don't know. But it's what these ancient texts always say. Why you should practice these, to become 150 or 200, but not like an old man, but like more like a young person. So, and usually there are two terms for this kind of person. It's a xianren, like this immortal person, but I think it's more like a hermit. He's living like in the mountains, like this pictograph is like a man in a mountain. So he's living a bit secluded from society. And the other is a zhenren, there's a true man or perfected or perfect being. And he is, that's not a term you find already in the Zhuangzi, 4th century BC. And yeah, this is more this cosmic spiritual being, I think, that you create through yourself. Maybe you have to find back in yourself, because everybody has it, but you don't know, and then you die, and whatever. You get lost. Maybe call it your true self or your soul, or eternal soul, or whatever. That would be more like a Western term, but the Chinese term is like the Zhenren. And Xianren is a little bit later than that term. What becomes clear from all these discussions, that there's no central authority, there are no like ordination certificates, no like controlling institution which wants to know which level you are, or like you do karate, you get a band like a black, the brown, or whatever. No, nothing. Registers, they're usually called in Daoism, what we know of. And there's also no like transmission of text. That's in traditional Daoist studies, where in the ancient time, from the each ordination would be accompanied with a transmission of a set of text. And you would, each time you're higher, you get more difficult texts. Texts were very important, but there's no mention of this kind of transmission at all. Themselves, they won't consider their techniques a religion, but a science. And of course, this is like the early 20th century. We will come back to that question later. But the point is that they say it's not a religion or something secret or special. It's just knowledge. It can be learned by anyone. You can just learn it. And so it's not specific or privilege of Daoism. If you're Buddhist or Christian or whatever, Islam, we can teach you. It's just a technique, or you don't need to become like a Daoist, and there's no color to it or whatever. Everybody can learn it. So that's what is meant, but that's what they mean with a science in their opinion. It's also openly taught and published. Everybody can find a teacher, or you can try to find a teacher. It's published because these techniques are discussed in journals. They're openly discussed in not seminars, but in these places where you can come together, like studios. So it's not that secret. Maybe actually how to do it, but the knowledge is not secret. How to do it is something different. Therefore, you need a teacher, master. They also don't consider them like professionals, or they like a separate class of people or social group. They don't wear specific clothes. They don't live in a specific place. They have these like studios, as I mentioned, but like have studios for everything. Also, painters have studios, and it's just where you can meet. But it's not like a temple or a church, or where you have to worship this or that. And so they're not any different from lay people. So there's no this lay clergy difference does not exist. There's also no mention of communal rituals or ceremonies. Maybe there are like kind of rituals, but they're not like important, that you have to perform them to be part of the group, or to show to other people that you are a master and that you can do that. I've also seen no mention of deities, in fact, deity names, or maybe there are, but they're not like you have to worship this deity or follow this deity, then you belong to this group. Or also no mention of images, that you need to have statues or paintings, or that they're compulsory, or that you should go to temples. No. As again, disclaimer, I haven't read everything in detail. Maybe I will come across, but what I've seen thus far doesn't point to anything in this direction. As a social group, they only exist as a bond between master and disciple. Maybe with people who are not maybe officially disciples, but follow a master, or you can visit, but they are not like a. But in usually in Daoist studies or religion, it's like a religious group, a cult, in a good sense, that's meant, a sect or whatever. They don't set themselves apart from society as a specific group. So these disciples, they are selected on the basis of sincerity, it's called. So if you're just honest and you want to learn this, then you can be accepted. And often these other parts, they are more like a neighborhood where a temple is, and then you just have to go to that part. And you cannot say, well, I don't like your temple, I go in the other neighborhood. Well, that's not possible. Even in Confucian ancestor worship, you're part of your lineage, and so it's all strict. You're part of this it's territorial. And I think most important of all, these practitioners found among all layers of society. I mentioned there's a gardener, a soldier, but many of these people interviewed, they are KMT officials or administrators in some way. They're related to the Kuomintang, KMT, the Kuomintang, the Republican Party is that, which then fled to Taiwan, but before that as well. And everything in between, from teachers to professors, everybody's interested can actually join. So this makes a very different group of people than we usually consider Daoist. And it's also not easy to recognize them or to set them apart or even to study them. But because how do you find these people and how do you study them? But we have this book with interviews, so that's nice, maybe a nice entry for further research. This is my own little schema I put in because most of you won't know these, like the ideological background of many of these ideas, what they try to achieve. Previously, I mentioned this xiantian, this prior heaven or anterior heaven, this idea, and this is a very ancient idea. It's also in very early I Ching, the Book of Changes, how it's understood. You have this world where we live in, and there's a world where you basically come from, before you were born. Sometimes it's just the time you were in the womb. That's called then xiantian, but actually it's before you were born. And what you do, the whole goal of achieving the Tao is returning to the void, the return. It's a process of reversal, return, where you return to this anterior state of anterior heaven is called. And so everything which is being, this world is yo, and which is non-being is wu. These are the Chinese terms. Emptiness, or it's the origin. There are different terms with. Maybe it's called Dao, but I think Dao is even before that, before everything was created. It's more like a source, but they try to, if they want to more describe it, they use these kind of terms of non-being, emptiness, and origin. Many of these terms that appear in these techniques, and the techniques discussed by these masters, they also make this division. The normal breath, the air we breathe, that's qi. We need oxygen, we need to breathe, that's normal. And essence, that's just the essences of your body, almost like the DNA, and also like semen, that's both. But semen is just like for women, the menstrual blood. It's the physical manifestation of that essence. And spirit is shen, is your mind, or is in this different world. If you're able to return to the state of anterior heaven, then it becomes like original energy, and you're not breathing this air anymore. Right? It's different kind of qi and this essence and spirit, and you are able to transform it then, which eventually leads to this void. And there's another division, these last two I added, because that's more for our modern Western culture. But how should we understand this posterior heaven or an anterior heaven? So everything which is external or material or physical, that's then the mundane world, that's where we live in. And the way where you want to return to, that becomes more through your own body, internally. That is your interior, or spiritual, and then I would call it sacred. I know Durkheim made it profane and sacred. This is a bit different. This is a Chinese interpretation of the mundane and the sacred. But I use the same term. But we will come back to Durkheim later. You're still hanging on because it's already like 7:10, but I still have a bit to go. I hope you still follow up. It's okay. Yeah. Okay. Because now go to the historical background. Right? This book was written or compiled in a certain time. Maybe he just found it necessary, and people, oh, this is just good promotion of the techniques we as a practitioners, we practice them and we just want to promote them, but they're also part of a larger historical social context. And that is usually how, not this book, but books similar to this one published in that era, and people practicing these kind of techniques are understood. So we have to understand this history, this short history lesson, very short, because probably you're not familiar with it, but just to give a short overview of this timeline of what happened in 1911. The Qing dynasty fell, the Manchu Empire fell, and it became a republic. And so the Republic of China, the ROC, Kuomintang, was the sole leading party. So that's KMT. Very soon it went downhill because the Japanese invaded. So first in Manchuria in 1931, and then it became a war in 45, and I think 1/3 or half of China was occupied by the Japanese. So most of the people, they all had to, at least the government, the KMT government, they had to flee to Sichuan. I don't know if you know where it is, but it's in the southwest. It's surrounded by a lot of mountains, and in Chinese history, all emperors would flee to this area. Because it's a very safe place and very hard to conquer. But then, after the Japanese were defeated, the civil war broke out between the Kuomintang and the communists. The communists were lurking in the background while the KMT was fighting the Japanese all the time. And so the KMT army, the Kuomintang army, was mostly depleted and lost. So the communists took over China in 1949, and the KMT and all its people had to flee to Taiwan, this little island in the south. Probably you know where it is these days. It's very popular in the news. 10 years ago, nobody knew where Taiwan was, but now they do. So many of these cadres of the KMT and other people who their lives felt threatened, all the army personnel, they all fled to Taiwan. And I think most of the intellectuals, the rich people, they even continued to the US, where they then occupied a lot of positions in academia, and very interesting period, in fact. So when there was a whole new input in sinology, and then when Chinese art history became the study suddenly, and whole new ideas came up. But okay, that's a different topic. So from 1949 onwards, Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the KMT, he continued his Republic of China in Taiwan. The Taiwanese themselves are not very happy with this period. They see it a period of oppression, and many people were in fact killed. But in 1971, I think the UN decided that Taiwan wasn't the official representative of China, so China became the official representative, and then Taiwan became this current state of somewhere in limbo, somewhere in between official and unofficial. So that's the background. And this is the period when this book and these practices were promoted. This book was published, and so you can see this background also reflected in the Fangdao Yulu. Many of these masters interviewed, they were part of this KMT. Even the author, he was not maybe KMT official, but he was an education official in Jiangxi, in his hometown. And when he came to Taiwan, he became, I think, in the education department, but the administrative department, became the chief of education in the administrative part of the National Taiwan University. So, so that was his work. So many of these practitioners, they all lived all over China. It's not from one place that they just crossed the Taiwan Strait to Taiwan. They came from all over China. Altogether, they fled to Sichuan in the southwest, and then they again fled to Taiwan. So they are from all over China. So it's a very representative sample of this kind of practitioners. Lila Zhou, he wasn't a practitioner before he came to Taiwan. He only started in 1954, and so he became, and then he started interviewing all these Daoist masters for over a period of 10 years. As I mentioned, I don't think any local Taiwanese Daoist practitioners were interviewed, but I have to check that again. There's a question mark over there. And Lila Zhou, he wrote in journals, and there's some other practitioners that they set up journals promoting or discussing these kind of Daoist techniques, these kind of techniques. And this already happened in the Republican period as well. It was very popular since, I think, 1900. And so it's just a continuation. This Fangdao Yulu just fits in this whole process. So it's actually very representative of what happened in the Republican period, but this time it's both in China and in Taiwan, but maybe not so very representative of the Daoist situation in Taiwan. So what was it part of? What were these? What was this typical climate? The dynasty, the Qing dynasty had fallen, and what we as Western people mostly say, the Chinese were in some kind of existential crisis. Dynasty had fallen. They saw they were lacking behind compared to the West. They had to improve especially the sciences and technique and industries. They were poor, so they had to strengthen themselves. In fact, they're strengthening always. They looked for all kinds of methods to strengthen the nation and the people, and promoting these kind of techniques was seen as was Tai Chi Chuan and Qigong, maybe what is called Chinese yoga, Qigong, were all considered part of strengthening the nation. And these were promoted from with support from the government. And so many of these KMT people, they were part of it. And later the Communist Party also had the same kind of people promoting these kind of techniques. Concerning Daoism, before this period, there was no Daoist religion. It was called Daojiao or whatever it was, but this term religion did not exist in China prior to the late 19th century. It was a term translated from the Japanese, 宗教 or Shukyo. Yeah. So it did not exist. And even the translated term 宗教 had a different meaning. Originally, it just meant lineage, teachings, was like specific to a certain sect, like ideological secrets or something of this certain sect. So differentiating from other. It wasn't like meaning religion, what we as Westerners mean with it. So the government, the Chinese government, I call this state modernization. So it's not that people want to do it themselves, but the state saw it necessary to establish religion in China. And of course, they modeled that after Christianity, maybe not very consciously. Many of these intellectuals, they had been trained in America, in Europe, and Japan, and they took their ideas from those countries where they were trained and educated in the universities, those ideas. Many of them also became Christians, and they just used this as a template to model this Daoist religion. So they had to create from nothing, from scratch, and they had to think and to come together and to say, what is Daoist religion? So that's a whole process, of course, and I think it continues until this very day. It's not only Daoism, it's also Buddhism, Islam, as I mentioned here, as part of the five religions of the Jiao. So the five religions, Christianity, Buddhism, Daoism, Islam. I think they're separate. Yeah, Catholicism.
Today,
I think they're separated.
Protestant and Catholicism.
But back then, I think the fifth one might be.
No, that's the point. Confucian, what is not in there? That's also, no, it's not. I'm sure about that. Because the Confucianism was deemed a philosophy by the Jesuits, and yeah, it's not that we agree with it nowadays, but they said so, and then it became a philosophy, and we still consider it a philosophy. So it's not a religion, and now it's a discussion if it's a religion or not. But still, these are Western terms. So as part of creating this, this state Daoist religion, it had to also on very Western way. It had to differentiate between like legal religion that was legal and superstition, which was illegal. And many elements of Daoism, like the spells and many of the rituals, what had maybe later, we don't know for the early, but for example, the spirit writing, that's kind of a possession, where it was a medium goes into trance, and texts are transmitted through him, and he starts writing in a sand with a stick, and then these writings are translated into a text, which were very common and popular in the 19th century. Other parts, they were all abolished. They were deemed superstition, but in a Western sense. And why, we don't exactly know. And so, of course, it should be scientific. So they made a choice that this part of Dao, what originally was Daoism, or what already happened everywhere, this is religion, and this is superstition. A bit arbitrary, or maybe not, but these practices discussed in these techniques and everything discussed in the Fangdao Yulu, the text we discuss, of course, are deemed science then, because then they are legal and you can use them. So this is kind of historical background. Also, what was necessary was to establish this Daoist association. It needs to have an organization with like a main text, like the Bible. It needs to have like a main god or something like a pantheon of deities. It needs to have an organization, places where to worship, like churches. Everything was modeled after Christianity. And of course, Daoism was deemed as China's native religion or indigenous religion. Buddhism was from India, it was not Chinese, and Confucianism was not a religion, it was a philosophy. So that leaves Daoism as China's native religion. And often you see that in Chinese writings, it's almost like the first sentence, in our native religion.
Can you say what time period was that?
This is the Republican period. This happened after the fall of the Qing in 1911. it's already started before that,
Yeah.
like in the late 19th century.
Okay.
Intellectuals started to discuss, we don't want many intellectuals, they didn't like anything Daoism or anything Buddhism. They in fact wanted to create a Confucian state, modeled after Christianity. Like come your way, these kind of figures, and they wanted to make Confucianism a state cult. And so it's a long process, and if you go to China, you can still see these. If you go a little village, and you still can see these communal communist buildings. It's like a little church, but with a red cross on it, not a red star on it, where people just had to listen to Mao Zedong, had to do Marxism and Leninism, and have been lectured like in church for weeks in a row or months in a row. Modeled after Christianity. It's a continuous process, but it started late 19th century.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lennert,
Yes.
if you want 15 minutes of discussion, you should stop in 5 minutes.
Okay. I will try. This is then very short. Already mentioned, I see the Fangdao Yulu as a continuation of many traditional practices. There's nothing new or modern about it. Is it part of a modernization? It already existed. Maybe the form is a bit different, but the practices themselves, the language, the text mentioned, they're centuries old, almost millennia old. Also, another why it was written. It's not like a codification, but it wants to show something to the people in Taiwan. It doesn't interview Daoist Taiwanese, but it interviews these mainland Chinese, saying like this is almost saying like this is Daoist, real Daoism, and this kind of discussion is more like polemical writings, where not maybe that directly or openly, but are criticizing or trying to codify. This is like the real stuff, and that is maybe not fake, but it's just a lower type of technique or whatever. Well, I have the dates over there that is continuing. That's also very old. They're always in competition with each other. Like in Christianity, people say, well, this is the right interpretation, this is the right interpretation. And writings appear. And so I also want to point to an interesting thing I found, which I usually don't come across, but this may be for sinologists. As I said, Daoism is not a term in Chinese either. The traditional terms are either Daojia or Daojiao. And also because of the Jesuits, they made this division, maybe a little bit later, but Daojia in the West at least became to mean Daoist philosophy, and Daojiao, the teaching, and one is the specialist originally. It doesn't mean school, but that's what it has became to mean in the West. It means Daoist religion. In China, in the Fangdao Yulu, I think it's a common idea because it's not like explained at all, but I found out it's used that way. Daoism is, you can use both, but it means Daoist theory, basically the text. And as soon as you find a Daoist master and you start practicing these and you learn the application, then you enter Daojiao. So it's like more different stages, or more like private and public, or theory and practice application. So that's also different from in the West. They had never heard, I think, of Daojia as philosophy, because that's imported from the West at that time. Many of these practitioners themselves, they don't make this difference. Well, very shortly, this is Professor Schipper's not resume, but a short biography. He studied with very famous people. He became himself a famous scholar, very broadly educated, also in anthropology and psychology. He became the first Daoist ordained priest in 1968. He was staying in Taiwan for 10 years. Later, I think he also returned for several periods. He was in Leiden later. Then after retirement, he went to live in Fuzhou. And in 2008, his final work, on which he worked for his entire life with a whole team of 30-something scholars, like this historical companion to the Daoist canon, 3 volumes was published, which is like a dating and summaries, historical context of all Daoist texts in the Daoist canon. I wish something existed for the Buddhist canon, but it's a huge masterwork, I think, when he died last year in Amsterdam. Maybe I can ask you to read it, but this is written in the preface, where not the author but the publisher meets him, and that he actually says that the books of the wonderful publishing house of this publisher, I read them all. They're not bad at all. He says, there's one that I like to read the most. The one I like to read best. Oh, which one? And without thinking for a second, he replied, the Fangdao Yulu, the record of inquiries about the Tao. That's pure coincidence. And he liked that book most. The strange thing is that he nowhere mentioned this book in any of his writings, and also the techniques or these people mentioned there, he doesn't mention them. So and now if we look at his views on Daoism, the Daoist body, just based on his 2 main works. One is his earlier work, first in French and then published in English, translated in English. And the later one is only in French. It's a collection of articles, with the first article explaining more his personal views. He creates a Daoism that he views as a continuous tradition starting in ancient China in local cults, usually referring to Granet. Marcel Granet is one of these early scholars, Dans et Légende, and that then was continued in the Tianshi Dao, in which he was ordained, this heavenly master order, and then which governed almost China throughout the entire history by means of these local cults, up to the present day, which still exists in Taiwan. So he has very unified idea of Chinese religion and Daoism. He actually thinks that the Chinese religion is equivalent to Daoism. That's what he wants to prove almost his entire life. It's like the Chinese native religion as well. And of course, you can see the contrast between the two. We first did this horizontal comparison. Now we have the frontal or the vertical comparison. This is how the West. I asked you to read an article by Ken Dean. It's unrelated to this topic, but he's a student of Schipper, and the way he defines religion, you can see all these ideas or definitions or concepts of Schipper's applied to in this article, and that's almost diametrically opposed to what's described in the Fangdao Yulu. So I made a little list to compare it. Of course, Daoist scholars have across these modern Republican period, new movement, as they call it. Sometimes they call themselves these new techniques, and they say, oh, it's part of modernization, meaning that this is modern Daoism, so it's not original. And what we study in the West, these rituals, the local cults, the altars, the priest ordination, the Daoist text, everything, that's the true Daoism, and which is now suppressed. But But actually, I think what may be possible is that because you can see actually we know more of Schipper now, and I read I think almost all of his writings. So you can see where he got his ideas from, and that what he studied, especially his anthropological ideas, you see it reflected in his definition of Daoism. And now we would call it a very structuralist approach to establishing a Chinese religion and Daoism. And many of seems to be influenced, but that's what he never mentioned. But by Durkheim and his theories on his religion. But okay. And he doesn't mention esoteric practices at all. None of these that I mentioned in our book. But he mentioned singles out one, which he seems to be the most important, which he then euphemistically called the sacred Heriogami, but it's the sexual arts, this yin yang stuff. And well, this is just a synopsis of what I meant. Well, thank you very much. Then.